Our 5-acre ranch had been our sanctuary for the past 7 years. We were not wealthy by any standard, but the modest house with its weathered wooden porch and the collection of rescue animals made us feel rich in all the ways that truly mattered. The autumn morning light cast long, golden shadows across our property as I sipped coffee on the porch, watching my son Thomas working with Star in the lower pasture. Thomas had always been a quiet child. When he was 6, doctors diagnosed him with severe social anxiety. He struggled to speak in public and would have panic attacks at school. Everything changed the day we brought home Star, a black and white miniature horse no taller than my waist. The connection between them was immediate and profound. Thomas spent hours grooming Star, teaching him tricks and speaking to him in full sentences when he barely uttered words to other people. Star was special among our 3 miniature horses. Thomas had trained him to respond to hand signals, to follow him without a lead, and even to fetch objects. The little horse understood verbal commands that would impress professional trainers. For Thomas, Star represented freedom from the prison of anxiety that had defined his early childhood. Our rural community had always been peaceful, with properties ranging from 5 to 50 acres. Most of us kept animals, grew vegetables, and minded our own business. That changed 18 months ago when developers purchased the old Campbell property adjacent to ours and divided it into 2-acre lots. Suddenly, our dusty road filled with construction vehicles, and 15 new homes sprouted where cattle once grazed. I first met Patricia Winters at the mailboxes. With her perfectly highlighted blonde bob and permanent frown lines, she introduced herself as the president of the newly formed Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. I politely explained that our property predated their development and was not part of any HOA. The tight smile she gave me should have been my first warning. "We will see about that," she replied, eyes narrowing as she surveyed my faded jeans and work boots. "The entire area needs proper standards now. The days of letting properties look like farms are over." The conflict started small. Letters about our fence height, complaints about chicken noises, demands to remove the tractor from view. I ignored them all, secure in the knowledge that their HOA had no legal authority over our property. Patricia, whom the longtime residents had taken to calling Karen behind her back, grew increasingly frustrated with each unanswered demand. On that fateful Saturday in October, Thomas and I were working in the barn when the distant crack of gunfire made us both look up. Hunting season had just begun, but no one hunted this close to residential properties. The shots sounded again, closer this time. "Dad, where is Star?" Thomas asked suddenly, his voice tight with worry. My stomach dropped. Star was grazing in the east pasture, the one bordering the Campbell property. I had just seen him there an hour ago. Thomas was already running before my brain could fully process the danger. I sprinted after him, my heart pounding against my ribs as more shots echoed through the trees. We rounded the corner of the barn and froze. 2 men in bright orange vests stood near the fence line. Between them and us lay a small black and white figure, unnaturally still on the grass. Thomas made a sound I had never heard before, a primal wail that seemed to rise from the deepest part of his soul. He broke free from my grasp and ran to Star's side. The smaller of the 2 hunters stepped forward, his face pale. "We had permission," he stammered. "The HOA president said we could hunt along this whole stretch, said nobody would mind." I knelt beside Thomas, who was sobbing uncontrollably as he stroked Star's neck. The miniature horse, who had brought so much joy and healing to my son, had been mistaken for a deer by hunters who never should have been there in the first place. And as I held my trembling child, I already knew exactly who was responsible. The next hours passed in a blur of grief and anger. I called Sheriff Daniels, who arrived 30 minutes later, his weathered face grim as he surveyed the scene. Thomas refused to leave Star's side, so I covered them both with a blanket and focused on giving my statement. The hunters, brothers named Mark and Jason Ellis, seemed genuinely distraught, especially when they realized Star was a trained therapy animal for my son. "We had explicit permission from the HOA president," Mark explained, showing the sheriff a text message on his phone. "She said this whole area was approved for hunting, that the landowners had all been notified." Sheriff Daniels sighed heavily. "This property is not under HOA jurisdiction, and no one notified the owner." He glanced at me sympathetically. "But if they were invited by someone they believe D had authority, this becomes complicated legally." The sheriff took statements from everyone and instructed the hunters not to leave town. As he was preparing to go, he placed a hand on my shoulder. "I am truly sorry about your boy's horse. I will do what I can, but you should know that hunting accidents like this, they rarely result in serious charges." After arranging for Star's body to be removed, I helped Thomas into the house. My wife Sarah, who had been grocery shopping during the incident, arrived home to find our son nearly catatonic with grief. We put him to bed with a mild sedative the sheriff had provided, but his vacant stare haunted me more than his tears had. The next morning, while Thomas slept and Sarah stayed with him, I drove straight to Patricia Winter's perfectly maintained craftsman-style home. She was watering flowers when I pulled up, wearing pristine gardening gloves that had clearly never touched actual soil. "Mr. Davis," she said coolly, turning off her hose, "what brings you here on a Sunday morning? If it is about those violation notices, I am afraid the deadline for compliance remains firm." I stepped closer, struggling to keep my voice steady. "My son's miniature horse was shot yesterday by hunters you sent to my property." Something flickered in her eyes, not surprise, but perhaps annoyance at being confronted. "I did authorize some local hunters to access the community green space. If they strayed onto your property, that is hardly my responsibility." "They showed me the text, Patricia. You specifically directed them to hunt along my eastern property line. You knew we had animals there." She removed her gardening gloves with deliberate slowness. "Perhaps this will teach you that keeping livestock in a developing area is inappropriate. That miniature pony was just a pet, and quite frankly, your entire operation brings down property values for everyone." My hands trembled with rage. Star was a therapy animal for my son who has severe anxiety. He has not spoken a word since yesterday. For a moment, something like doubt crossed her face, but it quickly hardened back into determination. "I am sorry about your son, truly, but your lifestyle choices are not compatible with where this community is headed. The HOA has certain standards." "We are not part of your HOA," I interrupted. Patricia smiled coldly. "Your property is surrounded by HOA properties now. You can hold out, but eventually you will find it easier to comply or sell. Now, if you will excuse me, I have a busy day ahead." As I drove home, my grief began crystallizing into resolve. Sheriff Daniels called that afternoon with news I had already expected. The hunters would face only minor trespassing charges, if anything. They had a text explicitly giving them permission from someone they believed represented the property owners. Legally, their hands were mostly clean. The days that followed were the quietest our house had ever known. Thomas refused to leave his room except for absolute necessities. He would not eat properly, would not speak, and most worryingly, refused to visit the other miniature horses, Bella and Max, who wandered their pasture calling for their missing companion. Sarah and I took turns sitting with Thomas, trying to coax words from him, trying to reach past the wall of grief he had built around himself. At night, I could hear Sarah crying softly in the bathroom, trying to hide her own heartbreak. The ranch that had once been filled with laughter and the sound of Thomas talking animatedly to Star now felt like a mausoleum of lost joy. One night, a week after the incident, I found Thomas standing at his bedroom window, staring out at the moonlit pasture. When I approached, I noticed he was clutching Star's halter, his knuckles white. "Dad," he whispered, his voice rough from disuse, "she did this on purpose, did she not? The HOA lady." I considered lying, protecting him from the cruelty of adults with agendas. Instead, I nodded slowly. "I think she did, son." Thomas turned back to the window. "Then she cannot win." Those 4 words from my traumatized child became my mission. Whatever it took, Patricia Winters would not destroy what remained of our life here. The office of Martin Reynolds, the only property attorney in our small town, smelled of leather and disappointment. The elderly lawyer listened patiently as I explained the situation, occasionally noting details in a worn leather notebook. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and removed his reading glasses. "I understand your anger, John, but legally this is murky at best," Martin said, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "The hunters were misled, yes, but they were also negligent in not verifying property boundaries. As for this HOA president, proving malicious intent would be nearly impossible." I leaned forward, desperate for any avenue of recourse. "She deliberately sent armed strangers to my property without my knowledge. My son has barely spoken since it happened." Martin nodded sympathetically. "The emotional damage is clear, but courts deal in evidence. We could file a civil suit for damages, but these cases are expensive and can drag on for years with no guarantee of success." "What about the HOA itself?" I questioned. "They had no authority over my property." "Technically correct," Martin agreed. "But these new associations often operate in gray areas until legally challenged. Your property is grandfathered in, but they will keep pushing boundaries until someone stops them, expensively and publicly." I left his office clutching a business card and feeling more defeated than when I arrived. The only clear path forward would require financial resources we did not have, especially with Sarah taking time off work to help Thomas. That evening, a flyer appeared in our mailbox announcing an emergency HOA meeting to discuss recent incidents and community standards. Though not officially part of their association, I decided to attend, hoping to publicly address what had happened to Star. The community center buzzed with tension when I arrived. Neighbors clustered in distinct groups, longtime rural residents on one side, newcomers from the development on the other. Patricia stood at the front near a podium, whispering intently to several board members. When the meeting began, I waited for an opportunity to speak during the public comment period. Before I could stand, Patricia addressed the room with practiced authority. "Before we hear from community members, I must address the unfortunate incident last weekend," she announced. "A local child's pet was accidentally injured during a controlled hunting activity." "Injured?" I stood despite not being recognized to speak. "My son's therapy animal was killed by hunters you personally directed to my property." Patricia's smile tightened. "Mr. Davis, please wait your turn. As I was saying, this regrettable accident highlights exactly why our standards committee has been concerned about non-conforming properties maintaining livestock in residential areas." Murmurs rippled through the room as she continued, effectively reframing my family's tragedy as justification for her agenda. When I finally received permission to speak, the atmosphere had already been poisoned. I described finding Star, explained his importance to Thomas, and directly accused Patricia of orchestrating the situation. Several newer residents shook their heads skeptically. A man in an expensive golf shirt stood up. While we all feel bad about the horse, my children cannot play outside because of roosters crowing at dawn from these farm properties. We purchased homes here expecting a certain standard of living. My family has lived here for 3 generations, countered Alina Jenkins, our 70-year-old neighbor. These newcomers knew they were moving to rural land. If they wanted suburbs, they should have bought in suburbs. The meeting devolved into heated exchanges. Patricia expertly redirected each comment to support her narrative. Rural activities were disruptive, unsightly, and decreased property values. By the end, the community was visibly divided, with several of my longtime neighbors offering supportive glances while others avoided eye contact entirely. Outside after the meeting, Alina approached with several other original residents. "This is not the first time she has pulled something like this," Alina confided. She had Bob Mitchell's restored tractor towed while he was in the hospital, claimed it violated some view ordinance, and the Thompsons were fined daily for their chicken coop until they finally gave up and removed it. "She is trying to force us all out," added Frank Cooper, who owned the property north of mine. "Developer money behind her, I would bet my last dollar on it." Their support bolstered me, but the division in our once friendly community was painful to witness. Former friends now looked at each other with suspicion. Property lines that had once been casually crossed for borrowed tools or neighborly visits now felt like fortified borders. 3 days later, an official-looking envelope arrived by certified mail. Inside was a formal HOA violation notice citing non-conforming agricultural activities and demanding removal of all livestock within 30 days or daily fines of $250 would be assessed. Though I knew they had no legal authority to enforce such demands, the intimidation tactic was clear. As I stared at the letter, hands shaking with anger, I realized this was never about Star alone. Patricia Winters had declared war on our very way of life, using my son's tragedy as ammunition. The property that had been our sanctuary was now the front line in a battle I never wanted but could not afford to lose. What Patricia did not understand, what she could not possibly comprehend, was that she had attacked the wrong family. My son's whispered determination echoed in my mind, "She cannot win," and I silently promised him that she would not. Thomas remained virtually silent for 2 weeks after Star's death. His teachers sent concerned emails about his disengagement at school. Nights were the worst, when nightmares would wake him screaming, reliving the moment he found his beloved companion. Sarah researched childhood trauma specialists until she found Dr. Melissa Chen, who specialized in animal-assisted therapy for children. The therapy office felt intentionally calming, with soft lights and walls lined with animal photographs. Thomas sat rigid and unresponsive during our first visit, while Dr. Chen spoke gently about grief. "Thomas, I understand you lost someone very special," she said, placing a small figurine of a horse on the table between them. "I want you to know that whatever you feel, anger, sadness, confusion, all of it is okay." Thomas stared at the horse figure but said nothing. For 3 sessions, Dr. Chen patiently worked with him, never forcing him to speak but creating space for his feelings. During our 4th visit, she introduced us to Marley, a therapy dog who immediately rested his head on Thomas's knee. "Animals understand grief differently than people do," Dr. Chen explained while Thomas hesitantly stroked Marley's fur. "They do not try to fix it with words. They just stay present with the pain. That night I found Thomas standing at the fence where Bella and Max grazed. He did not speak, but for the first time since the shooting, he extended his hand toward them. Max approached cautiously, sniffing Thomas's palm. Something shifted in my son's posture, a barely perceptible relaxation of his shoulders that nevertheless represented the first crack in his wall of silence. While Thomas began his slow journey toward healing, I embarked on my own path of research and resistance. Each night after Sarah and Thomas went to bed, I spread documents across the kitchen table, property maps, county zoning regulations, and every scrap of HOA paperwork I could obtain. The HOA bylaws revealed numerous inconsistencies. Though Patricia claimed authority over hunting permissions throughout the area, the documents clearly restricted their jurisdiction to only properties with explicit HOA covenants. More importantly, I discovered that hunting access could only be granted by a full board vote, not unilaterally by the president. I dug deeper into county records and found documentation confirming that our property and several others had grandfathered agricultural exemptions that superseded any HOA restrictions. The restrictions Patricia kept trying to enforce simply did not apply to us legally. My breakthrough came unexpectedly at the feed store, where I encountered Michael Winters, Patricia's husband. Unlike his wife, Michael seemed uncomfortable with confrontation and quickly became absorbed in studying horse supplements when he noticed me. "I want you to know," he said quietly without looking up, "not everyone on the board agrees with how things are being handled." I paused, surprised by this opening. "Your wife seems determined to drive us out." Michael glanced around nervously. "Patricia can be focused, but the hunting permission was never properly authorized. Some of us are concerned about potential liability." This casual conversation led to a clandestine meeting with David Garcia, another HOA board member, at a coffee shop 20 miles away where we would not be recognized. David slid a folder across the table, his hands trembling slightly. "Patricia has been exceeding her authority for months," he whispered. "She has been coordinating with Westlake developers about acquiring several properties, including yours. The company she works for handles their marketing." The documents revealed a pattern of targeted harassment against rural property owners, with internal emails discussing strategies to encourage compliance or sale. My property was specifically mentioned as high-priority acquisition due to its location. "She has been doing this to everyone," David added, nervousness evident in his voice. "I cannot be publicly involved, but someone needs to stop her before the entire character of this community is destroyed." Armed with this information, I returned home with renewed determination. In the pasture, I noticed something that gave me hope. Thomas was brushing Bella's mane. Though still silent, he had begun spending time with the remaining miniature horses each morning. Dr. Chen had explained that healing from trauma happens in small, incremental steps. "Look for the moments when the weight seems slightly lighter," she had advised. "Those are the victories." I watched my son's gentle movements with the brush, the careful attention he paid to Bella's comfort. His face remained serious, his posture guarded, but he was present with the animals again, a small victory indeed. That evening, as I organized my growing collection of evidence, Sh0t. Holmes silently placed Star's training notebook on the table beside me. Inside were detailed notes in my son's careful handwriting, commands, routines, progress reports on Star's training. I looked up at him questioningly. "So you do not forget what she took from us," Thomas said, his voice rough from disuse. It was the longest sentence he had spoken in weeks. I nodded, my throat tight with emotion. I will not forget Thomas, and she will not win. For the first time since the tragedy, something like determination flickered in my son's eyes. Two healing processes continued in tandem: my son's gradual return to the world and my methodical building of a case against Patricia Winters. Both would require patience, evidence, and faith that justice would eventually prevail. The resistance began as whispered conversations over fence lines. Alina Jenkins invited me for coffee one morning and casually mentioned that 4 other families had received similar violation notices about their agricultural activities. Frank Cooper reported being pressured about his antique tractor collection. The Millers were fighting citations about their barn height. Individually, we were vulnerable. Together, we might stand a chance. We need to organize properly, I told the small group gathered in my barn one evening. Document everything, build our case methodically. Alina nodded firmly. My grandson is a paralegal in the city. He recommended an attorney who specializes in property rights and HOA disputes. 2 days later, I met with Diane Rodriguez, a formidable attorney whose office walls displayed newspaper clippings of successful cases against overzealous homeowners associations. She reviewed our documentation with growing interest. "This is actually quite promising," she said, tapping the folder containing the evidence from David Garcia. "The HOA has clearly overstepped its bounds repeatedly. The hunting permission alone was a flagrant violation of their own bylaws." Diane outlined a 3-pronged strategy: document all harassment, challenge the HOA's jurisdiction over grandfathered properties, and investigate Patricia's relationship with developers. Her retainer fee was substantial, but the 7 affected families agreed to pool resources. "From now on, document everything," Diane instructed. "Record conversations if legal in your state. Save all communications. Send responses by certified mail only. Create a paper trail that cannot be disputed." Our phones became weapons of documentation. Every drive-by from Patricia's SUV, every interaction with HOA representatives, every violation notice, all were meticulously recorded and dated. I installed security cameras around our property after Patricia was spotted taking photographs of our animals from the road. My kitchen table transformed into command central, where neighbors would gather to share information and strategies. Thomas, though still speaking minimally, began sitting quietly at these meetings, listening intently to our plans. Alina suggested we attend county commission meetings to raise awareness about hunting boundaries near residential areas. At our first appearance, I spoke publicly about Sh0t and the unauthorized hunting that had traumatized my son. Several commissioners expressed concern, particularly when I presented evidence that proper hunting setbacks from occupied structures had been ignored. "This is a safety issue that affects all residents," I emphasized. "Children play in these areas. Next time, it might not be a miniature horse that gets shot." Commissioner Jenkins, Alina's cousin, proposed a review of hunting permissions and property boundaries in our area. The motion passed unanimously, creating the first official scrutiny of Patricia's actions. Frank Cooper, a retired paralegal, helped draft a formal petition requesting review of the HOA's scope of authority. 28 longtime residents signed, creating an official public record of our grievances. The document specifically cited agricultural exemptions that predated the development. Our coalition grew steadily, but so did opposition. Patricia called an emergency HOA meeting where several new residents complained about declining neighborhood aesthetics and stubborn holdouts refusing progress. The community division deepened, with some neutral families now pressured to choose sides. The situation gained unexpected public attention when Melissa Barnett, a local reporter, overheard a conversation about Star at the town diner. She approached me cautiously, notebook in hand. "I have been following the property disputes in your area," she explained, "but I had not heard about a child's therapy animal being killed. Would you be willing to share your story?" The resulting article in the county newspaper was factual and devastating. Child's therapy horse killed after HOA President grants unauthorized hunting access. The piece included a photo of Thomas standing beside Bella and Max, his face solemn, alongside details about Star's role in helping him overcome anxiety. Patricia's response was swift and vindictive. New violation notices appeared daily: fence height discrepancies, improper storage of hay, excessive animal noise. Her silver SUV cruised past our property multiple times daily, her phone visibly recording from the driver's window. "She is panicking," Diane observed when I shared the escalation. "Keep documenting. This pattern of targeted harassment strengthens our case." Other affected neighbors reported similar treatment. The Thompsons found their mailbox mysteriously damaged. The Millers received anonymous complaints about their property to county officials. Rather than intimidating us, these actions solidified our resolve. A subtle show of solidarity emerged in our community. Blue ribbons, the color of Star's favorite halter, began appearing on mailboxes throughout the area. What started with 3 or 4 houses spread until nearly 20 properties displayed them. Each ribbon represented a family willing to stand publicly with us against intimidation. At Thomas's suggestion, we created information packets explaining agricultural exemptions and property rights, distributing them to every household in the area. The cover included a simple hand-drawn picture by Thomas of Star with the words, "Protecting our community's character." Patricia's attempts to isolate us backfired spectacularly when she confronted Eleanor Jenkins about her blue ribbon at the grocery store. Eleanor, formidable despite her 70 years, stood her ground as Patricia demanded she remove the eyesore decoration. "You have taken enough from this community, Patricia Winters," Eleanor declared loudly enough for other shoppers to hear. "You will not take one more thing from any of us." Word of the confrontation spread quickly. 3 more blue ribbons appeared the following day. In a particularly meaningful development, Thomas slowly resumed his routine of morning animal care. Though he remained quiet, the therapist assured us his active participation with Bella and Max represented significant emotional progress. He began carrying a small notebook, documenting their behaviors and needs just as he had with Star. One morning, I found him demonstrating a simple command for Bella, his hand gestures precise and patient. When the miniature horse successfully responded, the ghost of a smile crossed his face, the first I had seen in months. That afternoon, our attorney called with news that would change everything. Her paralegal had uncovered documentation showing Patricia Winters was not merely connected to developers by her employer. She personally owned shares in Westlake Development Group, the company seeking to acquire our properties. "This is a clear conflict of interest she never disclosed to the HOA board," Diane explained. "We now have evidence of direct financial benefit from her harassment campaign." The pieces were finally coming together. Our coalition of neighbors, once powerless individually, had systematically built a case that could not be ignored. As blue ribbons multiplied across our community, I realized we had created something Patricia had never anticipated: a united front determined to protect not just our properties, but our way of life and the very character of the place we called home. The certified letter from Diane Rodriguez's office was addressed to the entire HOA board, not just Patricia. The formal cease and desist demanded immediate termination of all enforcement actions against grandfathered properties, full disclosure of Patricia's financial interests, and a special meeting to address unauthorized hunting permissions. The document concluded with explicit warning of pending legal action for harassment, exceeding authority, and conflict of interest violations. David Garcia called me the evening the board members received their copies. "You should have seen her face," he whispered. Patricia went white, then red. She immediately tried to adjourn the meeting, but 3 members insisted on discussing the letter's contents. The special HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday at the community center. Word spread rapidly, and by 6 o'clock, the room was filled beyond capacity. Longtime residents and newer homeowners stood shoulder to shoulder along the walls. Blue ribbons were prominently displayed on many lapels. Patricia arrived 5 minutes late, flanked by 2 men in business suits. She appeared confident as she took her place at the podium, though I noticed her hands trembled slightly when arranging her papers. "This meeting will address concerns raised by certain residents," she began, her voice clipped. "However, I must remind everyone that HOA governance is limited to members only." Diane stood immediately. "That limitation works both ways, Ms. Winters. Non-member properties are exempt from your governance, including enforcement actions, which is the central issue before us." I approached the microphone when called, carrying a thick folder of evidence. Thomas had asked to attend and sat stoically beside Sarah in the front row. His presence reminded everyone exactly what was at stake. "6 months ago, our family's life was peaceful," I began, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "That changed when my son's therapy animal was killed by hunters who should never have been on our property. Tonight, I will demonstrate that this tragedy was not an isolated incident, but part of a systematic campaign of harassment orchestrated by HOA leadership." For the next 20 minutes, I methodically presented our evidence. Maps showing property boundaries and agricultural exemptions. Text messages from Patricia explicitly directing hunters toward our property line. Documentation of escalating violation, notices targeting only properties that refuse to sell. Meeting minutes showing no board approval for hunting permissions. Finally, financial records revealing Patricia's ownership stake in Westlake Development. "These documents prove Ms. Winters stands to profit personally from forcing rural property owners to sell," I concluded. "She has used her position to harass and intimidate residents while concealing her financial interest in their displacement." Gasps and murmurs filled the room. Board members exchanged alarmed glances, clearly processing their own potential liability. Michael Winters stared at the floor, refusing to meet his wife's gaze. Patricia gripped the edges of the podium, her composure cracking. "These allegations are absurd. Everything I have done has been to improve property values and community standards. These outdated agricultural practices have no place in a modern development." Board member James Wilson spoke up. "Did you authorize hunting on non-HOA property without board approval?" "I provided guidance to local sportsmen about community green spaces," Patricia deflected. "That does not answer the question," James pressed. "Did you specifically direct hunters to the Davis property line knowing they had animals there?" Patricia's facade finally shattered. "Those animals do not belong here anymore," she exclaimed, voice rising sharply. "None of this belongs here anymore. We are trying to build something valuable, something progressive. These people with their livestock and tractors and blue-collar sensibilities are deliberately standing in the way of progress and property values. The room fell silent at her outburst. Patricia seemed to realize her tactical error immediately, attempting to regain composure. What I mean is that the community is evolving naturally, and certain properties have become incompatible with your development plans, Diane interrupted. Plans that would personally enrich you when these families are forced out. Several board members were now openly distancing themselves, physically moving their chairs away from Patricia. James Wilson cleared his throat. I move for an immediate vote of no confidence in the current HOA president, pending investigation of these serious allegations. Patricia's eyes widened. You cannot do that without proper notice. This is procedurally invalid. Emergency Provisions, Section 4.3, David Garcia stated quietly, pointing to the bylaws. Allegations of ethics violations permit immediate board action. The vote was decisive, 6-1, with only Patricia's vote in her favor. The temporary replacement would be James Wilson until formal elections could be held. As the gavel struck finalizing the decision, Patricia stood frozen, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. Then she moved suddenly, gathering her papers with jerking motions before striding toward the exit. As she passed our row, she paused briefly near Thomas. "This is not over," she hissed before pushing through the door into the night. Thomas watched her go, then turned to me with clear eyes. "Yes, it is," he said, voice small but firm. In that moment, as neighbors surrounded us with congratulations and relief, I realized he was right. The battle was not completely won, but the tide had decisively turned. Patricia's power was broken, and our community had found its voice again. The transformation of our community did not happen overnight, but the changes were immediately apparent. James Wilson, serving as interim HOA president, called an emergency board meeting the very next day to suspend all violation notices against grandfathered properties. Within a week, a formal apology letter arrived from the board, acknowledging the improper actions taken under Patricia's leadership. The legal proceedings moved forward methodically. Patricia faced ethics hearings and potential civil liability, while the HOA insurance company reached out quickly to discuss settlement terms. Diane advised us to focus our claim on tangible damages rather than pursuing extended litigation. Sometimes the best victor is the one that allows healing to begin immediately, she counseled. The settlement arrived 2 months later, compensation for Sh0t, coverage of Thomas's therapy costs, and a binding agreement that our property would remain permanently exempt from HOA governance. Most importantly, Patricia would personally cover the cost of a replacement miniature horse for Thomas. The check sat on our kitchen table for a week before Thomas was ready to discuss it. "No horse can replace Sh0t, he said softly one evening. "No," I agreed, "but perhaps another horse could help create new memories." Spring arrived with green pastures and wildflowers. Thomas had returned to school full-time and was speaking more regularly, though the carefree child he had been seemed forever altered into someone more thoughtful, more deliberate with his words and actions. Our search for a new miniature horse took us to farms across 3 counties. Thomas approached each visit with solemn concentration, carefully evaluating each animal's temperament. Nothing felt right until we visited Sunnybrook Farm, where a spotted miniature horse with one blue eye approached the fence directly to Thomas. "What is his name?" Thomas asked the breeder. "That is Champion," she replied. "He is very clever but needs the right person to train him." Thomas extended his hand slowly, and Champion nuzzled his palm without hesitation. "This one," Thomas whispered, the same words he had spoken years ago when we found Star. At home, Bella and Max cautiously accepted the newcomer into their herd. Thomas spent hours each day working with Champion, patiently teaching him the same commands.